people who give a shit about politics, I genuinely don't get it. And it's starting to piss me off a little bit. It's starting to piss me off a little bit when I see the type of things that people consume about politics. And it's a language I don't understand. It's a language I don't speak. And it's a type of content I fundamentally do not give a fuck about. And I don't understand how it has the popularity that it does. And then I realize this is a country of 330 million people, and at least 100,000 of them are lanyard-wearing political science teacher's pet nerds that all belong in a ditch. And that those people can do a lot to make something seem very popular. But that doesn't bother me. I don't care about popularity. What really, and anger is always something bad. Anger is always a sign of something in need of being fixed. So I am engaging in meditation so that I'm no longer angry about it. But I will confess I am very angry that even common people, ordinary people, and everyone in between looks at these nerds, that's what they are, as sources of authority and credibility. That these are people communing with power. They're like priests communing with the pharaoh. And that somehow that represents power, and that's what power is. And I don't care about politics if we understand that phrase in its conventional use. I don't care about politics. I care about power. I care about, in addition to political power, I care about metaphysical power. I care about physical power, actually. I care about every type of power. I think every type of power is the same kind of power, and that's what I care about. But politics, what is that? What is that? Politics. You know, I went on Rumble a few hours ago, and I was just looking at what was being streamed, and I clicked for maybe a few minutes, and I see people talking and gibbering about the Supreme Court decision about Trump. Who gives a fuck? Where does the interest in that come from? Please explain it to me. I tried to fake it. Last year, I tried to pretend to care about these things, to care about the minutia of American politics, quote unquote, to care about, the Supreme Justice, I had to pretend to give a shit about these things for content, but I fundamentally do not care about them. I don't care. It's meaning, there's all these names I don't give a fucking shit about. Talking about what? Talking about what exactly? I am not a good political content creator. I'll be the first person to admit that. I don't care about so-called politics. I don't care. I don't care about it. And I can't help but shake off the feeling that everyone who cares about it or is good at caring about it and presenting it is a pussy, is a weak, feeble, limp-wristed pussy who's speaking the language of deference to power. These people are eunuchs. They have no balls of their own. They have no power of authority or their own. So they just commentate and channel the authority of others that have it. But I reject that. I don't regard their power as legitimate. I don't want to communicate or commune with their power. Newswatcher.
You're too extreme. Just give your opinion on abortion.
Exactly. Newswatcher. It's a hobby. It's like sports. I don't want to commune with any established powers because I don't recognize them as powers. I don't recognize them as powers. I don't care what goes on in the Republican and Democratic Party because I do not recognize them as powers. Am I vain for that? Am I vain for not caring about the inner workings of American politics? Because I don't recognize it. And this sounds ultra-leftist, it sounds anarchistic. But I feel like if the level of engagement in terms of what compels Americans for that is on the same level as sports, then it's not fucking real. It's just not fucking real. I don't feel like I'm being an ultra-leftist when I say it's not real. It's a hobby. It's a type of, it's a type of sphere within a broader division of labor. It's a specialized. There's literally people who are specialists who wear glasses and wear lanyards who call themselves political policy wonks. And I'm reminded that the only politician I'm concerned about in America that I care about is Pol Pot. I'm reminded of that fact every time I've confronted with it. It is so infuriating. It is so infuriating that there are entire professions built around being a fucking cocksucker for politicians and for established discourses and established forms of power, as though there's some kind of actual relationship to real power there going on, when there isn't. There isn't any real power going on there. Do I sound insane? Do I sound insane? If that's not the real power, then what is the real power? Do you want to know what the real power is? The real power is when the FBI comes knocking on your door and hauls you away, or the CIA assassinates you. That's real power. The real power lies with these banking cartels that control the actual state, that are actually the source of authority, that all of the politicians bow before, like their pharaohs and their kings. That's the real power. It's the investors. It's the stakeholders. It's the shareholders. That's where the real power lies. And we, my friends, as American citizens, are not shareholders in this country. If there's anything you got to walk away with and take to the bank, it's that fact. We are not the shareholders of this country. It's not our opinion that's the source of authority and power in this country. Our opinion is not what matters. Our opinion, as a matter of fact, we are sheep. We are sheep. The American people are sheep. Let's be frank, they are. Every single thing that we pretend to care about as a nation and as a people is because of discourses and talking points that were created by others. We care about them because they're the hot topics that were put before us. And we argue over them and we squabble over them like a bunch of idiots, but we were not the ones who created the conversation in the first place. It was just set before us. The game was rigged from the start. We didn't choose the rules of the game. We didn't choose what game it is. It was thrown at us, and now we choose what team we're on. I never liked team sports as a very young child in elementary school. I never liked it because I always thought to myself, why should I run around and kick some ball? I didn't choose the rules for this game. I only liked war. I only liked LARPing and fighting. That's what I liked because there are no rules. You understand? And it's the same thing when it comes to politics. We are thrown before us some pre-established framework within which we are allowed to articulate an existence politically and in terms of the power that reigns over us and rules us. And we pretend like we have an opinion on it and we pretend like we care about it. And why do we do this? Because ultimately we're trying to brown nose our way somewhere along the lines to the top. Or we're trying to appear like authorities to our peers around us, that we know more about the people who are, we know more about the random opinion of the guy in charge than someone else. So it begs the question of what power actually is. I was on Rumble, I tuned into Nick Fuentes' stream, and I say, wow, it's such a huge sensation all over X, supposedly, and then I tune it in, and it's gibber nonsense about, well, Trump Supreme Court. How do you even give a shit about that? How does someone even pretend to give a shit about that? I can't even pretend to care. I can't even pretend to care about these topics. But this is what you have to sound like and talk like to be taken seriously. But does this make me an anarchist? I think that opens up, and I'm going to critique myself, or open up an avenue and channel of critique my haters aren't smart enough to. And ask the question, does this just make me an anarchist? Do I believe that true political authority and true power is just based on the integrity of individual will? So it begs the question. And the answer to that is no. It's a resounding no. That's not where the source of actual political authority and power lies. You don't represent political authority just because there's an integrity as far as the decisions and choices you make. You don't represent a form of political authority even just because you have the most integrity when it comes to your personal honor. So what is actual real political authority? What is actual real political power? See, political theory is something that has never been elucidated upon or expounded upon within Marxism, Marxism-Leninism at least, in any official capacity. What actually is real power if it's not politics, this thing that we call politics? What is it then? And this should set the tone for what I want to talk about tonight. This is exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about power. I want to talk about what power actually is and what it actually refers to. And what is authority? And there's a common misconception that, of course, Mao is correct. Political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. But I think that leads to too much reductionism on the part of Marxists, to be too content with this statement, too shallow in their analysis of it and their appraisal of it. So that leads them to the view that power is just violence. It's just the ability to use violent and coercive means to get people to obey you and to do what you want. Again, that's still within the anarchistic bourgeois frame of what political power is and power is. And it's wrong. It's wrong for only the reason that, logistically speaking, it's impossible. Unless the majority of people are taking direct order. I mean, think about it for a second. There's a ruling class that rules us, logistically speaking, that has power. How can it hold a gun to the head of every single armed soldier that is in its employ in order to enforce power? I mean, somewhere in this logic, things break down. Even if we go with the caricature of dictatorial power, a dictator, a king, you think a king has a gun in his hand and he's pointing this gun at some other guy and that guy's pointing it? That's not how it works. It's not simply on threat or on pain of violence that power exists. That is ridiculous, right? When Mao said political power comes from the barrel of a gun, I don't think you should interpret it in this anarchistic way that power is purely based on the threat of physical extinction. I think rather, Mao was referring to something deeper. He was referring to the something more at play than just physical violence, but also, for example, the willingness to employ violence, the willingness to risk violence upon oneself, the willingness to point the barrel of a gun in the first place. See, these evince something about the nature of power much deeper than what's on the surface. They evince something about what it actually is, which cannot be reducible to what it appears as. And what is that exactly? To understand the metaphysics, for lack of a better word, of political power and of sovereignty, you need to first understand how a community, how a nation, how some kind of social being, right, as something we can regard and relate to as objectively real, can be said to exist as more than the sum of its parts. When we depart from the methodological individualism, according to which a society is just a collection of sovereign individuals, and the individual, of course, being defined by the capacity to make choices, we then can understand how what we call politics and the state as an abstraction, and it's not an abstraction for the reason you think. The state is not an abstraction in the sense that it doesn't have tangibility and concreteness, that it's just derivative from tangible individual wills and their relations thereof. No. The use of the word abstraction in Hegelese, actually abstraction is a process of violently ripping apart from a more holistic and integral totality. So actually we begin with an objectively real social being, not an individual, but a social being. Okay, Lukács, who I hate, calls this a totality. I reject that phrase and I reject that term, a social totality. But it can that phrase can guide you to an understanding of what we're talking about here, right? Some kind of something that is objectively real that includes individuals while not being reducible to the individuals which comprise it, but actually is a more fundamental point of reference and starting point for individuation itself. Individuation which comes into being and develops in response to this thing, right? This social object, right? If we understand it this way. So, in this sense, politics, as a form within the division of labor and the state, is an abstraction. It's an abstraction it's an abstraction from a social being. It's not an abstraction from a collection of tangible individuals or the relations thereof. It's an abstraction from a mode of production. Meaning, when we say the state will wither away in communism, we do not mean by that central authority will wither away. We don't mean a central existence or a unifying existence, a unified existence of communities, societies, civilizations, peoples. Well, that will disappear. It's more in reference to politics as a special division of labor within the kind of, I hate this phrase, but the totality of social relations of production. So this is where you have to begin when you want to understand what we mean by real politics or objective, real political power. It has something to do with a very specific relationship to a mode of production. A specific relationship, and another word for a mode of production we can use, actually, is a historically constituted community of people who have a very specific or have a particular totality of social relationships defining them. A mode of production is producing something in particular. It's not just producing biological individuals. It's producing a specific historically constituted existence. And we call this a nation. We call it a civilization. You can call it whatever you want, as long as it fits the bill. And politics is the art of giving expression to, articulating, marshaling, and commanding the originary and the fundamental contradictions that are at the heart of that mode of production or that historically constituted community. Politics refers to a special sphere of activity, a special relationship toward society and the world that is based on a responsivity to these originary and foundational contradictions. Notice I say foundational contradictions. I don't just mean contradictions. I mean the contradictions that are fundamental to what a mode of production is in essence and in content. Politics is about the recognition of social contradictions. It's not just social contradictions, that's class struggle. But the dominion of recognizing those contradictions, whether in a false way, whether in an unscientific way, or a scientific way, that is politics. So, for example, American politics, in its official form, can be defined as a specific way, however unscientific, however false, however untrue, but nonetheless a specific way in which the contradictions within American society are recognized and given recognition. And we see how that plays out in the contradiction between the Democrats and the Republicans. Rather than the vulgar view, according to which we just kind of assign different classes, discretely tangible classes behind the different teams. Okay, Caleb Maupin kind of did this, and I totally reject it. We're like, the Republicans are the industrial capital, and the Democrats are the financial capital. And that is just not really true. It's not really true. I mean, the corporations that support the Democrats, first of all, they support both. That's the thing. First of all, I don't see a meaningful distinction in the U.S. between financial and industrial capital. There is no distinction between these different forms of capital. Capital only takes one form, and that's financial capital. The economic industrial form of production that exists in America, the various companies and corporations that, that can be defined that way, like steel corporations, car corporations, whatever you want to say, those are companies in large part that are structured by finance capital in the first place. It's really when you get to Silicon Valley that maybe you can talk about there's a tension, maybe there's a tension between Amazon and, Wall Street as a whole, which means all the industrial monopolies plus, financial capital is the only preeminent monopoly. But when we talk about the conflict between industrial capital and finance capital, we're not talking about a conflict between different forms of capital. What we're actually talking about, more specifically, is a contradiction between capital itself, exchange value, and new relations of production and expectations and standards of civilization that are defined by use value, right? The idea that we need more public transportation and more factories and more oil drilling, that is not an interest that is necessarily bounded up with any logic of capital right now. There's no capitalistic interest which stands to gain from reindustrializing America right now. That is a policy proposal by Maga, let's say in 2015, that is based on a specific acknowledgement of the supremacy of use value over exchange value. Just like in China, use value is in command, not exchange value. Use value is in command in China. You may use the world market to realize that agenda and those aims, but it's not to fulfill the interests of any segment of the capitalist class. Trump's promise in 2015, and it was a lie, it was a swindle, but it was still something that resonated with the American working class, which is to bring the jobs back, to bring the factories back, right? That was an agenda that was based on use value. It was based on the supremacy of some kind of use value, delivering some kind of use value, some social necessity, something that's good and necessary for society. Maybe, of course, he wasn't saying it would, he's going to nationalize the economy and all this kind of stuff. But logically speaking, the promise elevated use value as supreme over exchange value in the very nature of the promise, right? We're going to maybe use these methods of the market and tax cuts and whatever to make this outcome happen, but it's about the outcome, not about the means by which it's realized, right? So we're not dealing with a conflict of interest within the capitalist class. There's no such conflict of interest. I find that analysis wrong and shallow and not really elaborated to enough of an extent to where you could say it's rooted in fact. That is an analysis that I think is rooted in a kind of suspicion and a hunch, but it's not really true, right? And also, Chris, to add to what you're saying, that saying Republicans are industrials is a joke, it's totally a joke, because in the 1980s, it was the Republicans who were very aggressively lobbying for financial deregulation to allow finance capital to go wild. And there were even some Democrats who represented the legacy of the New Deal who kind of were skeptical of that. So to say that Republicans represent industrial capital is totally wrong. It's totally ridiculous. And it wasn't even stereotypically true until Trump, where we decided to, for whatever reason, to make up the idea that industrial capital exists in the U.S. Show me the industrial capital. I mean, unless you're talking about Amazon and these new Silicon Valley startups, I don't know what you're talking about. But in any case, to go back to the topic of politics and what politics is, we are talking about different ways of recognizing objective contradictions that are at the foundation of society and the reproduction of society. And how are these contradictions specifically at play and the acceleration of the polarization between the Democrats and the Republicans? Here, I think we can get to a very sophisticated and eloquent art of misrecognition and deception and more or less false consciousness. I don't know what else to call it. It sounds vulgar and it sounds simple, but in the conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans, you don't necessarily have an authentic. I'm not. I know this is a trope, and oftentimes the trope is inaccurate because let's be honest, they're employing lawfare against each other. They are going after each other by any means they can exhaust, short of the criminal ones, right? So that it's a real conflict, but it's not an authentic political conflict, if only for the reason that it's not based on, put it this way. I mean, I don't know how to phrase this without it sounding confusing and giving you a headache. What you have here is a passive medium by which the objective contradiction at the heart of America and American society is given expression. And I say passive in the sense that it's not based on a recognition of contradictions as contradictions. It's not based in a recognition of the objectivity of contradictions. That's only something communists can do, actually. Which is why, in my view, we'll save that for later. We'll save that for a second. But it's not only communists that can engage in politics authentically, actually. Sometimes unscientific consciousness can accidentally approximate the contradiction in such a way that it gives unique and exclusive recognition to the contradiction without only just passively giving expression to it accidentally and symptomally, right? But we will shelve that and save that for later on. In any case, you have the United States of America, you have the government, you have the official form of legitimate authority that we recognize as a society, and the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans takes as its square one a specific way in which the contradiction in question that we're talking about is given recognition. And how it's given recognition is actually what defines the history of the post-war period of the American state and its development and the Cold War, right? Because the contradiction that is at the foundation of American society is, you could say it's class struggle and be correct. It's just not specific enough. It's not particular enough. But it's interesting because America, in the post-war period, from the very outset, let's not complicate this too much, already after 1929 and the necessity of the New Deal, there is some kind of strange contradiction at play at the heart of American society between economic policy designed for some kind of social, societal use value, welfare, and common good, and the institution of private property, the institution of, the free market. Like, very quickly, the contradiction between Republicans and Democrats when it came to domestic policy in the post-war period was really about, like, the New Deal versus the pro-business Republicans, increasingly pro-business Republicans, like big government socialism versus the free market. I mean, on a superficial level, that in part is what defined their difference. Not entirely, but like even then it was there. And then obviously with Reagan and neoliberalism, like that becomes the defining standard around which American politics articulates itself when it comes to domestic policy. It's like, free market and laissez-faire versus the big government, legacy of the New Deal Democrats. But how does that recognize, at what contradiction does that difference evince, even if passively, the recognition of at the heart of American society? Well, it actually is an objective contradiction to begin with, that the New Deal had to happen, right? On the one hand, America is a liberal country in the old classical sense of the word. It's a liberal country where the government is based upon a negative conception of freedom and a negative conception of rights, where the government has to limit itself absolutely and exclusively to its enumerated powers, and the sphere of civil society, more or less, is kind of left to its own devices in the form of, relationships based on voluntary transactions between like sovereign individuals endowed with, specific rights and liberties. That was the standard understanding and view of the role of government until the New Deal and until FDR. Now, see, it's interesting because I remember I was actually an undergrad. I wasn't in graduate school, but even as an undergrad, I was exposed to various different arguments. I guess this is one of the few things I learned from school. But I was exposed to a lot of different arguments that I remember about how it was very contentious in terms of, like, was it really always the premise, though, in American politics that this was the case? Like, is it just that FDR came and started transgressing liberalism? Or is it even true that the United States was always liberal, classically liberal in the British sense of the word? Like, did we not have a sense of the common good and, the common welfare and, the need to balance individual and, common communal rights? I guess there's ambiguity, there from the very beginning. But and then maybe with the era of Lochner type reasoning, in the early 1900s, as they call it, Lochner-like reasoning. Lochner-like reasoning, if you don't know what that is basically what judicial historians refer to as a period of American history in which, for example, the government does not have the right to intervene in the relationship between voluntary transactions between individuals, and broadly kind of interpret the Constitution so as to, like, for example, allow state legislators and governments to pass laws, about the workday and about, regulations regarding health and all these other kinds of things. The Lochner era of constitutional reasoning basically said that the government has no right to interfere in the voluntary relationships between individuals economically, because the government's role was to just protect the rights of individuals. There's no way to kind of recognize the subject of the common good. And governments can outlaw prostitution, you can outlaw drugs, sure, you can do these things. I believe it was in the Lochner era, that prohibition was passed in the U.S., and that wasn't shot down by the Supreme Courts. That's fine, but that still has to kind of confine itself to a logic of what is allowed for individuals or not. But in terms of their relations, that is not a subject that can be given recognition in any kind of way, right? You can restrict alcohol, you can restrict drugs, you can restrict prostitution, whatever, regulate gambling, yada, yada, yada. But the government's primary role is to limit itself to defending people's liberties. So the government has a negative sense of freedom. To the extent to which government has to intervene is an extent to which it's a necessary evil, and it's a kind of watchdog of civil society. But it's not actually an entity that facilitates the realization of the pursuit of happiness by itself, So there is a contradiction here, and maybe it would be really hard for me to locate the origins of that contradiction thoroughly enough. But you can say it is the same and this is kind of where it becomes difficult from the Marxist perspective. Because it's like, am I proposing a kind of trans-historical contradiction at the root of America as a historically constituted nation and community that somehow like exists in a way that's not reducible to a kind of specific era of the relations of production and the mode of production, and it's like it becomes tricky, you know, because, for example, this is why political science, or let's say political theory, is so important and fundamental to Marxism-Leninism right now, because you can argue that the relations of production, the superstructure endangered by the relations of production, you know, in America at least, has in some sense remained constant, formally. Formally speaking, it's the same superstructure as in, you know, the late 1700s, you know, 1790. It's the same superstructure. Sure, it may have, it can alter in some ways, quantitative ways, you know. It can do lesser, or it can do more, or it can function differently even. But formally speaking, it's the same constitution as the one that was ratified. It can have different stuff in it. It can have more amendments or less amendments, but it's the same constitution. It's the same document. It's the same thing in a way. And you know, it would be easy to say that America's principal and founding contradiction lies in the New Deal, where the breakdown and the capitalist crisis endangered the necessity, even for the defense of the capitalist class itself, to kind of adopt some aspects of socialistic planning and policy, and that this continues and remains to be the fundamental and principal contradiction at the heart of American society. But, you know, as I alluded to, and I mentioned actually directly in my speech, which I gave at the Institute for a Free America conference and that event, Free America to Free Palestine, you can kind of broadly categorize that contradiction, and you can generalize it, and it would work. And it wouldn't be vague. It would actually make sense, this kind of contradiction between the tenuous unity upon which the United States rests. It's a union so tenuous that united is literally in the name of the state and in the country. We have to be express and explicit in our specification of the name of this country and call it the United States of America, because it is by no means a given of our national, historical, and civilizational reality that we are united. That we are united, and this is what's so peculiar about the United States, that we are united is a political fact. That is very strange. That we are united as a nation is a political fact. It is not necessarily a fact of underlying substantive relationships of production or civil society more generally. It is a political purport. It is a purport based on the exercise and recognition of political authority. But it is not necessarily a fact of a material fact of our, you know, history or our civil society relationships. Any government can come and go in Russia. Any government can come and go in China. And China itself had a warlord era. But that China is united is not just a political fact. It's a historical fact. The same thing is true for Russia. That Russia is united is rooted in something historical, not just political. But the unity of the United States appears to be an exclusively political purport. Like so much so that it has to be in the name. So at the very outset, this historically constituted nation and community we call America and the United States already begins, this community, this mode of production, has as its foundation a contradiction between the purported integrity of a union, you know, the integrity of a unity, and the various different private relationships and interests, I'd rather say private interests, whether foreign or domestic, that challenge the integrity of that union. Whatever whatever the goals of that union, whatever is necessary to maintain that union, it doesn't matter. So whether it's FDR, passing laws that, I don't know, infringe upon the economic liberty and free market, doesn't matter. Because he's doing it on behalf of what? The interests of the union. He's doing it on behalf of the interests of America as a country. He doesn't care about these stupid, private businessmen or whatever. Like he's putting the country before them. That's what FDR, that was why he was so popular politically. That was his campaign, that was his brand. That's what I mean to say. Okay, and, Lincoln, you can say the same thing. And you could say the same thing for the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers of the United States, they really were engaging in a kind of politics in the conventional sense of the word, having to negotiate and balance all of these conflicting private interests to bring all of these states together to form a united government. There was a lot of compromise that was necessary at that level. But that tension and that contradiction is still there. And every epoch of American history can be understood through, and I don't think this is an arbitrary generality such that it's an abstraction. I think there's something so fundamental about it in ways that I don't think is true for other societies. Because, for example, when we discuss the class struggle in England, are we talking about a struggle for the integrity of the Union of Britain versus private interests? No, you're talking about a struggle between, different classes or segments of society, of civil society, right? To which the state has the pretense of neutrality in regards to, but in reality is owned by the capitalist class. And everyone is purported to be an equal citizen, and so on, equal under the law, but civil society evinces the reality that there's a fundamental contradiction at the level of people's status. Fundamentally, at the root of how society is reproducing itself in the first place. England is England, Britain is Britain, France is France, Germany is Germany. Communists are not carrying with them the mission to unite hitherto separated, fiefdoms. That's something that Bismarck did. That's something maybe Napoleon helped to do. It's not something communists had to do. That wasn't defining the content of communism. Although, it's so interesting because in Russia, I see a lot of right-wing idiots constantly claim that the Bolsheviks were the equivalent of, the affirmative action liberals, and the Russians were being guilted for being all of that stuff. First of all, it's so stupid. It wasn't a cultural policy, it was a national policy. Meaning, when the Russian Empire collapsed, which wasn't because of the Bolsheviks, by the way, when it collapsed and was thrown into chaos and disarray, many different segments of the Russian Empire who were constituted by conquered and oppressed nationalities seceded. And they wanted to leave and go their own way and break apart a hitherto united state, right? And the Bolsheviks and Lenin's national policy, which Putin has critiqued, I think, falsely, wrongly. Although, Stalin, I think, ultimately was correct. But I don't think Putin appreciates enough why Lenin had to, not just as a matter of principle, have an unconditional right to national self-determination. Why did the Bolsheviks revive all of these dead nations and so on and so on? Well, because you see a pattern. In almost every single SSR in the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks had to fight rival forces of national independence. Take Ukraine, for example. Many of us are puzzled why was Ukraine granted existence and autonomy by Lenin and the Bolsheviks? Well, because there was another Ukraine independence movement, and to really destroy secessionism and to maintain the integrity of this state, the Russian Empire, which is not the Russian Empire anymore, but like to maintain the integrity of that historically constituted community, they had to make concessions to all of these groups that before never got any recognition under the Russian Empire. So that's why they had to kind of engage. That's why they had to have that specific policy. And it's interesting because only communists could have united something like the Soviet Union. The ability to assert, this common good, this common interest, this union over the various private and particular interests, that is exactly something, that is the purport of communism. That's in communism. It's in the word, right? And so, of course, all of it brings us back to Plato, or I should rather say the severed head of Plato, but now I sound schizophrenic. But keep that in your mind. There's something kind of Platonic about this pattern I'm pointing out, when we take it back to the United States specifically. When it comes to see Lyndon LaRouche, I think he was the only one to kind of create this dichotomy as not only the central dichotomy of all U.S. history, but all of world history, right? And I completely reject his dichotomy. I completely reject his theory. It is far too much exaggerated. It's far too undialectical. And but I think there's a reason why he arrived at that view, which the reason you can maybe be charitable toward it. Can you be charitable to his conclusion as much? Probably not. Because it led him in such false and wild directions. But he viewed, for example, the principal conflict at the heart of the United States' existence as between Plato and Aristotle. Plato being the assertion of the primacy of the one, a kind of the Platonic one, the Platonic good, as pre-existing particulars, the primacy of the universal before the particular, right? Versus Aristotle, who regards the universal as a kind of amalgamation, as something derivative from the particulars, right? So for LaRouche, it's clear that the vision of the United States as a confederation of particular states was the Aristotelian view, whereas the Platonic view, which asserts the primacy of the union before the particularity of, the states' rights and whatever, that was the Platonic view. The grain of truth in his analysis, it's a grain of truth. It's a very, very small grain of truth, I think. But the grain of truth is that there was a tension between the purport of the United States versus the kind of substantive and established private particular interests. But what I think LaRouche totally neglected and overlooked and failed to understand was that in this very tension at the heart of the existence of the United States and America as a nation, the universal, the purport of the universal, it's not just some Platonic nonsense of the assertion of some abstract, substanceless, indeterminate universality before all particular reality. That's kind of the most... If you're a Hegelian, you immediately know what's wrong with that view, right? It's a notion of indeterminate universality. American history can rather be characterized as a kind of tension between, yes, this purport of a United States, a union, and the way that union is struggling to ground itself in some kind of substantive, particular reality itself. What particular and determinate content is a worthy and sufficient referent for the original dream of the founding fathers of a union. What is a worthy referent? What is a worthy particular and substantive referent of that purport, of that universal? In other words, what is a worthy referent? What is a worthy particular referent of the purport of universality that is at the foundation of the United States? That is the tension that characterizes, that is the context of the conflict and the tension at the heart of U.S. history. And this understanding also allows us to overcome the various follies of LaRouche's very kind of dogmatic, black and white Manichaean view of U.S. history. For example, LaRouche opposes Hamilton to Jefferson and says Hamilton is progressive, Jefferson is a kind of reactionary or something. But it's not true. It's objectively not true. Jefferson did represent the yeomen, right? He represented this kind of the common folk. And it's clear based on his stance on the French Revolution. Jefferson never abandoned the French Revolution. Even through its worst excesses, he never turned his back on it. The rest of the kind of founding fathers did. And the Jacobins in the United States who sympathized with the progressive forces of the French Revolution, they were associated with Jefferson. How can you ignore that? Let's turn to Andrew Jackson. He regards Andrew Jackson as bad or as purely Aristotelian because Andrew Jackson kind of was assaulting the integrity of the Union by deferring and decentralizing power back into some kind of more particular components. I don't think that's nuanced enough. When we think about Jacksonian democracy, the so-called phrase of Jacksonian democracy, that's the foundation of American populism. In the literal sense, there was a Washington establishment. The small, the American common folk were not being given enough representation, quite literally. There was a lot of corruption and embezzlement, and he positioned himself as a kind of champion of the small guy. So you see, it's not dialectical the way in which it's inframed as just between Plato versus Aristotle. It's not a conflict between philosophers, okay? It's a conflict that the only one philosophical outlook can even appreciate, which is the Hegelian one. It's the struggle to arrive at... There's a search that is at the heart of U.S. history. It's a search for the substantive and particular referent of the universality itself. Because there is no satisfaction, historically speaking, in just the conceit of a United States. Oh, we are a union. We have the conceit of being, we know we're a union. And that doesn't need to be tested or mediated or confirmed in reality in any kind of way. I think the best example of this is actually Martin Luther King, who rebukes that kind of Platonistic dogma, right? One-sided. Martin Luther King is very much giving recognition to, the particularity of a specific circumstance and reality in America. And it's precisely the recognition of that particular reality that he regards as the fulfillment of this purport of a united America. And in this case, it was a kind of racial segregation and so on and so on. So it's not just that racial segregation, that reality was an obstacle to the conceit of the Union, the United States. It was that only through this struggle of the American people in a determinate way, coming together and uniting as one people in a specific way, right? That only through that can that purport of a union be even given reality. So, of course, the bourgeois appropriation of MLK which defines the regime we live under today in many ways, right? Was a very different kind of interpretation rather than the one I just described. But I think the one I described is the one that's objectively and historically real. So the first question someone might have is like, well, how does class struggle figure into this? And class struggle figures into this view, the Marxist one at least, I think very eloquently. Because when we understand the proletariat as a particular class whose particular interests simultaneously correspond to the common interest or the universal interest, already we discover a logic at play which, strangely and oddly enough, complements the fundamental civilizational historical tension at the root of America's development into a nation in the process of becoming. That is why I think communism is so oddly appropriate in America. Nothing is a coincidence. It's not really odd when you have a more integral and historical understanding of the roots of communism itself. But America is a nation that is so fit for communism because it's a nation whose process of coming into being, of becoming, right, corresponds with the necessity of communism, or the inevitability of communism, I should rather say. And specifically Marxism, specifically Marxism even. The acknowledgement and recognition of the proletariat as the subject of history, that precisely is the referent that America was looking for in order to exist, to acquire a definite historical and national existence. That is the proletariat. But Marxism should not be used lazily to where we just kind of use these phrases without actually applying them in a specific and determinate way. Understand something about Marxism. Marxism is, in addition to being a method, it's also a specific logic. Or it's a specific recognition or appreciation of a logic, of a logos, if you will, right? Marxism corresponds to a specific type of political subjectivity which recognizes the contradiction at the root of the historical existence of a society in such a way that the contradiction itself is given recognition as something that objectively exists, rather than mystify or obfuscate the contradiction, as like LaRouche does of Aristotle versus Plato or something, It's an immanent critique. And when I say immanent, I mean that in the sense of all you have to do is look at the purport of, let's say, the superstructure and the contradictions that accompany that purport versus its actuality and its reality. This is what this is where you find these materially objective contradictions that we can define as classes, and different relations of production. For example, if you're an infrared viewer, you should know this by now, because I've been talking about it for years and years and years. The logic of class struggle or class antagonism is a fact immanent to the purport of the subject of universal law, right? Of universal civil society. It's the universal equality before the law that knows no distinction, which stands in contradiction to kind of feudalism, where people were classified differently on a legal level according to their variations in, ownership of land, nobility, and so on and so on. It's in the very way in which this new superstructure comes into being versus its actual material premises that define the nature of class struggle. Because even if we presuppose universal equality before the law, we still end up realizing a contradiction, which is, okay, between people who we're all equal before the law, we're all entering into association with each other voluntarily, at liberty. Okay, well, some of us own shit, and some of us only own the means by which shit is made. Okay? And when you exchange those two things, labor for capital, or labor for a wage, it produces something strange. It produces something that's not seamless within the series of free relationships between people. It produces a paradoxical relationship that leads to a totalizing division of the whole of society, increasingly into two camps, just as the Communist Manifesto described. Why? Because there is a fundamental difference between commodities and the material way in which commodities come into being. To classify the way in which the commodity comes into being as itself just another commodity, labor, its commodification as wage labor, somehow that fails. Labor resists full commoditization, at least in a way that is harmonious with the logic of commoditization. And this failure is manifested in, Marx talks about it in Capital, the falling rate of profit. The contradiction between surplus value and price, or value and price more generally, the contradiction at the heart of value, the nature of value. So that is an example of a kind of immanent contradiction I'm talking about when we're talking about class struggle. So the Marxist insight into class struggle and proletarian consciousness, people sometimes say something stupid. They're like, well, Marx didn't come from a proletarian background. And, here's the trouble with this. Let's call it substantialistic view of class struggle. I don't know what else to call it. I don't want to mean that in the Andrew Kleeman sense of the word, though. The problem with that is it's that proletarian consciousness and class consciousness is a question of insight into, let's say, the logos of history, and more specifically, the modern history of capitalism. But what it is not is, like the consciousness corresponding to some kind of tangible, empirical reality. That is not what proletarian consciousness is. You want proof? The Chinese Great Proletarian Culture Revolution. Where were the proletarians? Where were the bourgeois, for that matter? Tangibly speaking. Tangibly, where was the proletariat? Tangibly. There was no proletariat, tangibly. Why? Because in China there was, tangibly speaking, no bourgeoisie. And if there was, it was so negligent and so irrelevant that it was irrelevant to the Great Proletarian Culture Revolution. Think about it. But does that render the notion ridiculous? And does that render the purport of the Culture Revolution as totally outside of Marxism? I think that's not true. I think rather, what we're approaching is, and this has always been a crisis within Marxism, just as much as it's a crisis in America. But if we can characterize recent history in one way, one general way, one of the patterns we can start noticing is virtualization or desubstantialization. For example, Baudrillard, I'm not pronouncing his name correctly because I never attended any college lectures. I've only read his name on the internet and through books. But he describes this as the kind of simulacra or simulacrum, I don't know, suck my dick if I'm saying it wrong. But you know what I'm talking about. Baudrillard. Got it. He describes that as kind of a copy without an original referent. without an original substantive referent. So copy without referent is kind of the aesthetic and the when I say aesthetic, I don't mean it in a superficial sense of appearance and cosmetics. I mean it in the sense of like the new sensibility, right? It's the general pattern of the late 20th century and in the 21st century as well. It's kind of like, for example, media is a reality in a way that doesn't have a direct substantive referent. For example, money, it used to be backed by gold. Now it's backed by nothing. It's the copy without a reference, right? But the same thing was true for Marxist class consciousness. Marxist class consciousness is a copy without a clear, tangible, and substantive referent in the form of a clear revolutionary subject that is demographically and culturally constituted, such that we can point to it and say, there is the proletariat specifically. So that is the kind of general tendency of history, and what this means precisely, I can't fully exhaust it in this stream. But during the Cultural Revolution in China, it's the same exact thing. Proletarian consciousness, proletarian culture, that is the copy. But where is the substantive referent, right? That's the copy, but where's the original? You know, it's the same thing. So we can return back to the question of America, you know, just for a second. Because maybe we can then say something strange and maybe provocative. What if the first copy without a referent is the United States of America itself? It's precisely the United States as a nation, which is the only nation. Call this American exceptionalism if you want. I don't care. There is no other nation like that. And every nation is unique in its own way. Or let's call it a civilization, a nation, whatever you want. But we're clearly not referring to a nation state, a homogeneous nation state here. Just using nation very vaguely and broadly, right? But the United States is the first historically constituted community and historically constituted existence, which begins with a copy and is expects the referent to come later. It begins with a copy, and it's expecting the original basis of the copy to come at a later point in time. That's the essence of, by the way, speculation. And speculation in land, by the way, is one of the most fundamental attributes of American history at its foundation. You know, it's a speculative position. You're beginning with a purport. You don't have the thing you need to back it up right away, though, right? So this is, as a historically constituted existence and a community, that's what the United States is, right? And what I told you before about the search for the particularity that is worthy of the purport of that unity of the United States, you could maybe also rephrase that and say, what is the originality that justifies the copy that is the Union, right? Where's the original? The original is missing, and that's kind of the central existential problem of America. And we can go further, and we can go into recent history and then talk about Maga. Maga, what is Maga? Because then something even more strange happens with Maga, right? Maga somehow is a copy. Clearly it's a copy. Maga is a virtual form of America. So it's a copy. Like, it's a form of America, primarily digital form, actually. Kind of new way to articulate America in the age of Baudrillard's, whatever's, hyper-reality. And its original, its originality that it's derivative from as a copy is like the totality of American history. Everyone's like, MAGA is Make America Great Again. What America is it trying to return to? And it's like, you missed the point. The America that it's trying to make great, when has America ever been great according to MAGA? America itself, as a nation, its existence is great inherently. That it recognizes the loss of America the loss of the American dream, the loss of the purport of an America, of a United States, right? Somehow, it's very strange, simultaneously is a way of giving expression to that purport in a new way, in a new virtual way, which acknowledges its discontinuity with the thing it's referencing, which is the kind of totality of American history. So Maga stands in this kind of virtual reality, whose real reference is, you can maybe say, that the total historical existence of America. And Maga is the copy of that, right? And what do we find? We find in Maga a suspension, full suspension of America's historical existence in this kind of virtual form. Fully, with all the skin in the game. All of America, all of the United States is risked in it. So it's a copy that develops in a way autonomous from, and even in a way that is in primacy with regard to the original thing, right? The original reality. So what do we make of this as communists? And what conclusion do I believe all of this is increasingly driving towards? I mean, to rope back to my original opening statement about my profound lack of care for so-called American politics, what do I think American history is actually tending towards, objectively, as far as the existence of the United States of America, or America as a nation? Well, I think we are entering an era which is looking back upon the American era of world history, like in the sense of moving away from it. And we are now left to reminisce upon what reality has survived the destructiveness and the novelty that America has brought to the world. America's era of world history, of world historical preeminence, is over. But we now are in this post-apocalyptic setting in which we have to kind of fundamentally transform our understanding of reality, because America did a lot to undo much of the foundational purports of the dominant global outlook. For example, this is why originally when I launched Infrared, I was so anti-Anglo philosophy and metaphysics, because my whole view is that Anglo philosophy, it wasn't LaRouche stuff. LaRouche is someone who blames Aristotle for everything. That's not my view. There's also an Anglo version of Plato, for example. But it's not that I hate England. It's that I recognize America supplanted England, world historically. What Baudrillard describes as the copy, the virtual, and the real, the relationship that he describes with the copy and the original, copy without an original, that is a consequence, world historically. That is a metaphysical way to comprehend the world historical significance of America for human history, how America has impacted global civilization and civilization in general, right? This is what I mean to say. But because we have not yet fully awakened to the way America transformed the world fundamentally, we are still operating under the presumptions and assumptions of the Anglo-Saxon metaphysical view that came before America. So that's what I mean to say, you know? And that is a view primarily based on the kind of primacy of the origin over the copy, right? So it's kind of like the reverse and the opposite of America. I think that the preeminent kind of existential, if we're going to generalize it, problem we're faced with today is rediscovering substance in a non-reductionist way, rediscovering tangibility. Even dialectical materialism it's a problem for us because we regard reality as a state of becoming, as the same way Heraclitus did. And this is what my book is about, by the way. But we don't really understand how things acquire definite, concrete, tangible existence beyond some kind of fully relative frame. We regard everything as just purely a state of flux. But what actually exists? Because to say only change exists, really, and ultimately is the foundation of Western idealism, from Heraclitus. This is, the whole logocentric view, In the same way that I'm interested in a of course it comes from Heidegger, but a new beginning for Heraclitus. I'm interested in a new beginning for Plato as well, a new understanding of the one. And that, my friends, will be at the foundation of the next chapter of America's history. Some kind of concrete and substantive unity, not just an ideal purport, but something which, while simultaneously having the kind of dynamism and loftiness of a purport, corresponds to something real, particularly real. As real as the Grand Canyon and the rocks of the American West, as real as stone. And we have to think to ourselves, what stone is worthy of American history? A history defined by this contradiction and this pure flux. I mean, what actually is it, though? What statue and what monument have we actually made as a country in the totality of our history? What does that monument look like? Monument made of stone,